Welcome back to the West Ham Voice. I hope you're having a good day, a good week. How many of you enjoyed the fact that the politicised World Cup went the way it did between the US of A and Belgium on Monday night? Look, let's not talk about that. You know, the politicisation, can't even say the word, of football is terrible. It should never have happened. It completely ruins our football. It ruins the way football is done in what happened with the issues that happened with the US of A. But anyway, let's move on. This isn't about the World Cup. It's not about political issues. It's about West Ham United. Look, before I carry on, if you're new to this channel or if you've watched the West Ham Voice before but yet to subscribe, QR code appears there. If you're going to enjoy this video and you're new, why not click on that QR code and become a subscriber? So what are we going to talk about? Well, recent stories about West Ham have been about players potentially arriving at the club. And with Niels Koppen now as our director of player recruitment, players such as the young under-21 international Gustavo Sarr are being linked. And I like the sound of some of the players that are being linked to us at the moment. But every rebuild to a squad has two sides to it. You know, we get excited about the new signings and everyone looks forward to, reading about them, hearing about them, looking at YouTube clips about them to see what we can find out about these players that might be coming to the club. But what's the other side of the coin, of course, is about players who are going to leave to make way for these new players. Now, that's the reality of building a squad. For every player that walks through the front door, someone usually has to walk out the back door. And the latest reports suggest that's exactly what's beginning to happen here. Edson Alvarez looks increasingly likely to leave the football club, this time for good. And Alvarez Wan-Bissaka is now attracting interest after a very decent World Cup. Now, I'll come on to Wan-Bissaka a little later on, but let's start with Alvarez, because if reports are accurate, it feels that this time his West Ham career is coming to an end for good. And if I'm honest, I don't think many supporters are going to be genuinely shocked by that. If you rewind, when Declan Rice left for Arsenal, replacing him was never going to be an easy task. It's going to be a big challenge. And I think that's why when we bought Alvarez, many fans thought, oh, hang on a minute, perhaps this is the replacement for him. But in all honesty, they were quite different players, aren't they? They both did a similar job in shielding the back four, but they weren't quite the same going forward. But when Alvarez first arrived from Ajax, there were moments that you could actually see why West Ham spent over £30 million. He looked aggressive, he looked committed, he wasn't afraid of a tackle or two. He brought a certain physicality to the team. There were games where you came away thinking, we've got a real player here. And there was a real sense that once he'd settle into English football, we'd see the very best of him. But unfortunately, that consistency never really happened. One week, he'd completely dominate. The next week, he'd give away needless free kicks, collect a yellow card or two, and the odd flutter of red cards as well. And not before long, it became something of a bit of a running joke amongst fans as to how long before Edson Alvarez gets booked, or can he go through 90 minutes without picking a second yellow or a red. Now, look, don't get me wrong. Every football fan supports or loves commitment from a player. You'd much rather have a player who's willing to put his foot in than someone who's going to go hiding when games get physical. But I guess there's a huge difference between being competitive and being reckless. And too often, Alvarez crossed that line. Sometimes his timing wasn't always right. His decision-making in certain moments let him down. And it meant that instead of becoming the reliable defensive midfielder that we're kind of all hoping for, he became a player who you can never quite predict from one week to the next as to what performance he was going to put in. And then, of course, there were the stories away from the pitch. Now, it's important to be fair when discussing these things because none of us are there at the training ground. None of us are there behind the scenes. We don't really know what goes on apart from the odd suggestions from a journalist or an ITK. But there were rumours that Edson Alvarez wasn't the easiest of players to manage and He had disagreements with Julian Lopetegui and also suggestions that Graham Potter wasn't entirely convinced by him. If you remember, Potter made this strange pre-season interview about, sort of like alluding to clearing the decks. And I think Alvarez was one of those players where he kind of thought was a bit of a distraction to the squad. He was a leader, certainly, but a distraction, we'll never know. But it was Potter that sanctioned his move to go on loan to Fenerbahce for the season. And if we're honest, that felt like a pretty clear indication regarding Alvarez's long-term future at West Ham. But once again, things didn't really get going. His performances at the Turkish club remained inconsistent, and then came a long-term injury, another setback, another season that never really gathered momentum. And yet, the fascinating thing is, despite his club issues, his international side didn't lose faith in him. He recovered in time to make the World Cup, and he was the captain of the Mexico team. Now, captaining your country at the biggest tournament in world football isn't something that kind of happens by accident. It does tell you that there is a decent footballer in there, which makes his West Ham career all the more frustrating, because I don't think any of us have ever doubted his ability. The frustration has always been that we've only seen it in flashes. Now, reports suggest that FC Cologne are interested in taking the player on an initial loan, and I don't know whether it be an option or an obligation to buy him in order to make the move permanent. Look, if they are interested, I actually think that this makes a lot of sense for everyone. Alvarez gets another fresh start. Cologne get an experienced international and a player who's captained his country. West Ham free up wages, create room in the squad, and generate flexibility for the remainder of this transfer window. You let Alvarez go with his 80, 90,000 pound a week salary, it means that you've got movement there to bring in a player who can fill that space, probably younger, probably cheaper, and certainly on lower wages. But here's the point that really stands out to me. With Matthias Fernandes having already left, I did sort of tinker with the idea that maybe Alvarez might be the sort of player to come back in to fill that void that Fernandes has left. He's experienced after all, played at the highest level, still only 28 years of age. So why wasn't that considered, or why isn't that being considered? Because I guess every report coming out of the football club seems to suggest that West Ham are actively looking for different types of midfielders, different types of players, and not just one or two, but players in a number of positions who are going to come in with that kind of Nils Koppen stamp of authority. And that's where things change, because this isn't anymore just about replacing Alvarez or Fernandes or any other player that leaves. I think something bigger is happening behind the scenes at West Ham. So if the imminent departure of Alvarez leaving West Ham feels understandable, the next player linked with a move away comes from quite a different perspective, Alvarez Wan-Bissaka. Now, if you asked me 12 months ago which players I'd expect to keep at the club, Alvarez Wan-Bissaka would be near the top of the list. Let's be honest, when West Ham signed him from Man United for a mere 15 million, there were plenty of eyebrows raised as to how we were getting him for such little money. However, Man United supporters couldn't quite believe that they were getting the 15 million. Look, this is a defender who's brilliant on one-to-one defensive duties, but apparently offered very little going forward. Some even joked that Man United had somehow managed to pull off one of the deals of the summer back 2 years ago. Fast forward 12 months, we had the last laugh. Wan-Bissaka didn't just settle in, he flourished. He looked reborn, and week after week, he was one of our best performers, with very few attacking players getting the better of him. His recovery pace, exceptional. His timing of tackles, perfect. But perhaps the biggest surprise was how much his attacking game was a lot better than we were told. He looked more confident going forward. His link-up play was good. He wasn't just a defender. He was actually contributing at both ends of the pitch. And by the end of the season before last, he'd become our Hammer of the Year. You think about that. A player who many Man United fans thought they'd be happy to move him on, arrives at West Ham, and within a season, he's our player of the year. Incredible turnaround, I say. Last season, however, the levels weren't quite the same. Now, before anyone jumps into the comments suggesting that I'm going to start dissing Wan-Bissaka and saying he's a poor player, far from it. I think his performances reflected the team around him. West Ham struggled last season. Obvious, we got relegated. Confidence disappeared, managerial changes, results became increasingly difficult to get. You know, when a team is struggling to collectively, even your best players look a yard slower and a little less confident. Very few players escaped criticism last season. Wan-Bissaka wasn't alone. But compared to the standards that he set in the first outstanding season, there was definitely a dip in form. Consistency wasn't quite there, and yet, over the last few weeks, we've seen the Wan-Bissaka we had in the first season at West Ham. Playing for DR Congo at the World Cup, he looked revitalised again, confident, energetic, positive, probably one of the best defenders at the World Cup. And now, after relegation, there have been reports linking Arsenal with an interest in the player. Now, other clubs are believed to be monitoring the situation. Everton apparently have been ready to put a bid in for him even before we got relegated. But again, got to stress that all this stuff is rumour. Until bids are made or clubs confirm negotiations, it's just rumour. So do I know whether Arsenal are really interested? I don't know. It's an intriguing story, nonetheless. But there are suggestions that if we are looking to allow Wan-Bissaka to go, it's going to be for the region of £25 million. Imagine that. Let's just stop there for 1 second. Because we buy a player 2 years ago for 15 mil. He wins Hammer of the Year. He enhances his reputation, which falls significantly in the second season. And at the age of 28, because he's had a few good games in the World Cup, all of a sudden, we're looking for 25 million. What do you do then? Do you keep one of your best players because supporters might think he could help us in the championship? Or do you make a cool £10 million profit and trust your recruitment department to find a decent replacement? Look, with the possibility of players like Wan-Bissaka, Alvarez, I dare say more, Ward-Prowse, Todibo, Fulkrug's back. I hope not for too long. Saw him in training on Monday. But anyway, with all these players likely to leave, and I think, and I'd hope that the very best football clubs will have been planning for their replacements in advance. That brings me back to Niels Koppen. I hope that the groundwork is already done or being done to find suitable replacements for all these players. I'd be amazed if Koppen hasn't already built a detailed shortlist of every position in the squad that needs improving. Not just one name, but potentially 2, 3, maybe 4 names for each role. What if Koppen already knows exactly who replaces Alvarez? What if the successor to Fernandes has already been identified, many saying Gustavo Sarr is just that? And what if there's already a right back on the shortlist who Nuno believes will fit his system and could be even better than Wan-Bissaka? We might not know all the names yet. In fact, some of them may never even be linked publicly. But internally, and that's the bit I love, by the way, these leaks are not happening, which makes it even more difficult to speculate what exactly is going on. But internally, I'd be very surprised if those conversations weren't already well in advance. Because here's what excites me about West Ham's new structure. We know for years it often felt as that West Ham were reacting in the transfer market rather than being proactive. A player leaves, we panic, we get someone in, and then we change direction, or we change manager, or that manager, doesn't want that type of player, and the next manager wants something completely different. Before you know it, the squad becomes a collection of footballers signed for 3 or 4 different projects, 3 or 4 different styles of play. Sound familiar? How many times have we said over the years, he's a good player, but I don't know where he fits in? Or why did we sign him if the manager never wanted him? The lack of joined up thinking has cost West Ham millions over the years, but Now, for the first time in quite a while, it feels kind of different. Nuno knows what he wants in his team, the type of players that he wants. Koppen knows the type of player needed to make that happen. The recruitment department identifies those profiles. Everyone appears to be working towards the same vision, or at least that's what we're hoping. But if that's the case, then maybe the departures of Fernandez, Alvarez, Wan-Bissaka, and everyone else aren't warning signs. Maybe they're simply the first phase of a much bigger plan that's now in place. And this is where I think we have to kind of zoom out and look at the bigger picture. Other well-run clubs not only survived player departures, but have used those departures as stepping stones to improve. You buy a good player, you hope their value increases, you sell them at a profit, and then you invest in the next crop of players. Brighton, as an example, lost the likes of Moses Caicedo, Alexis McAllister, and yet the club didn't fall apart. Why? Because those clubs don't build around those individuals, they build around a recruitment model. And now we need to be competing with the likes of Brentford, Bournemouth, Brighton. How bizarre is that? All smaller clubs in size, but way ahead of us when it comes to how the club is run. Now, if we get to their level of managing players in the transfer market with our vast support and our infrastructure, it shouldn't be too long before we're back in the Premier League and overtaking these teams in terms of development and league position in the future. That's exactly what West Ham have lacked for years. And maybe that's why Daniel Kretinsky was so determined to reshape the footballing operation, not just by keeping Nuno, but by putting Niels Koppen in charge of football recruitment. Now, I know, and I'm not stupid to assume otherwise, with David Sullivan out of the picture and with Brady gone as well, it's making it easier to do all this, but this should have happened years ago. Now, look, ultimately, Koppen's going to be judged by the players he signs. Nuno will be judged by the football his team produces. And Kretinsky will be judged by whether this new structure actually delivers promotion and eventually an established return to the Premier League. But for the first time in a long time, it genuinely feels as though there's a clear path. And that brings me back to Alvarez and Wan-Bissaka. If both players leave, perhaps they're evidence of a football club making difficult decisions for the benefit of the bigger picture. Or are they difficult decisions? That doesn't make those decisions easy. But if Nuno and Koppen genuinely believe that they've identified players who are younger and better suited for the championship this coming season, maybe the departures of Fernandez, Alvarez, Wan-Bissaka and all others really isn't the story here. Maybe they're simply the first dominoes to fall. The first evidence that West Ham are finally becoming proactive instead of reactive. Okay, if you've enjoyed this today's video, like I said, hit the like button. Please become a subscriber by clicking on that QR code. Click on the notification bell to let you know when I'm next on. And also, please hit the hype button because that elevates this video on YouTube for others to watch. Thank you for watching. I'll be back again. There's plenty of stories. I've got another one lined up, so be ready for that. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And I'll see you all very soon.